In today's episode, you'll learn how to interview guests that aren't used to being recorded. Welcome to Podcasting Q&A, where you'll learn the best tips and strategies to launch, grow, and monetize your show. This week's question comes from Will.
Hi, this is Will, and I'm starting a new podcast called Current Climate. And I have a question on bringing on guests that are not used to being recorded. So what are your tips on bringing someone on who has not done a whole lot of interviews, maybe has not done a lot of recording experience in the past? Thanks so much.
If your guest isn't regularly on podcasts or used to being recorded or doing video calls, their inexperience might play a big role in why they're a little hesitant or nervous being recorded. People can feel uneasy knowing that their every word or action is being recorded. It's not something that most of us are used to. A nervous or uneasy guest could result in a very awkward interview, which could mean more work for you in post, or worse, you might have to redo the whole interview. But worry not, because there are things that you can do personally to help a guest feel more confident being interviewed. For starters, I personally like to send an outline of the interview to my guest before we actually conduct the interview. Now, my outline doesn't have every question I'll ask, but it does give them a good idea of the topics we'll be covering and some of the questions I'll be asking. This is helpful because it allows them to prepare on their own and feel a lot more confident going into the interview if they know what to expect. Tip number 2, consider getting your guest input on the interview. I personally like to call my guests before the interview to get their input on the outline I sent and the questions we'll be covering. Sometimes, if they have a topic or subject that I know they're really good at speaking, we'll incorporate that. If you approach the interview from a sense of collaboration and giving your guest a sense of ownership, it'll make them feel a lot more comfortable for the actual interview. Tip number 3, send them an episode of your podcast to listen to prior to their interview. This gives them a chance to get familiar with your interview style and the tone of the show, so it's not a complete surprise when it's their turn to get behind the mic or in front of the camera. For one last tip, we've invited Alex from PodMatch to share his insight on how to help a guest feel more confident for an interview.
So recording a podcast episode with a guest who's not used to being on podcasts or maybe even behind a mic at all. This is something that I had happen to me. There was somebody that really had always wanted my podcast since day one when I launched, because I heard this person speak at a conference about 10 years prior. And I'd also read many of their books, and I just always learned from this person, so I knew my audience would have the same understanding of how great they are and really what they kind of bring to the table. The thing is, when I reached out to this individual, they told me, they said, Alex, I had never done a podcast episode before. So for me, I was like, all right, well, let's figure out how to do this without all the tech, because you didn't have a mic or anything. The problem was, when we actually got to the conversation, our pre-conversation was great, but when we hit the record button, he froze up. It's like he'd never been on a stage before. Apparently, he was better on a stage than behind a mic for some reason, which is something I now know is quite common. But he really didn't know what to say. So I had to shift from my normal way of doing a podcast interview. What I usually do is just run through the content, do very minimal edits, but it's with people that are very experienced. But with this guy, I realized I had to change things. So what I decided to do was slow down a little bit. So I told him, hey, let me ask you that question again, but forget that I'm recording, actually. We're not going to really do an interview. We're just going to have a conversation, and I'll just be recording in the background. If it's good, I'll share it with some people. And by telling him that, I really calmed him down a lot, and I re-asked him some questions, even asked him to elaborate on something like, hey, what did you mean by that? It was kind of short. And I got it to be a really comfortable conversation. It ended up recording longer than I normally record, but when I broke it down during editing, I built a really great episode that here I am more than a year later, people in my audience are still talking about and still listening to. And this is with somebody who will probably never do another podcast episode again, but I was able to kind of change the perspective of it so he wasn't as nervous, so I could get some really great content out of him.
Thanks for listening to Podcasting Q&A. If you have a question you'd like us to answer on a future episode, go to speakpipe.com/Buzzsprout or click the link in the show notes to record a brief audio message. Make sure to subscribe to the Buzzsprout YouTube channel to watch future episodes of Podcasting Q&A, or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. That's it for today. Thanks for listening, and as always, keep podcasting.